Hi everyone, and onwards into urbanization we go. So we are going to start off talking about this concept of what a city is and how cities have emerged over time. So we've established in class that a city simply does not meet a simple definition. You cannot simply say X is a city and Y is not a city. It's a very nebulous term. It is relevant to the size of the population. It is relevant to the land area. It is relevant to the services offered there. But we simply can't codify that into a single definition. But we are going to talk about some general terminology relevant to the study of urbanization and the study of how cities have emerged globally over time. The term we're going to use now to describe what you may have in your head as the conception of a city, we're going to call a central city. So the main city around which the suburbs have grown. So in the area where you and I live, this is going to be Washington, D.C. That's the center city. That's the centerpiece and the hub of the economic and cultural activity from where we live. Now, you and I live in an area where this is going to be particularly difficult to differentiate between some of these other terms because not only are we a component of the Boswash corridor and that general megalopolis, but we're also a component of an area that's by definition emerging. Its suburbs are sprawling and have their own services and nodes. So some of this we're actually almost going to have to consider independent of the DC area, but let's give it a go. The term urbanized area is going to refer to any area that's continuously built up area with buildings and population density. And as it says there, with no reference to political boundaries, meaning that it's not as if you take one county and you say this area is urbanized, while this area is not. You're speaking about sort of the density of population, the types of architecture. You're going to find more apartment buildings and more high density housing. You're going to have a lot more services in an urbanized area. Where you and I live, this is sort of synonymous with the idea of a metropolitan area. So an urbanized area can be an area that doesn't necessarily have to just be around a single town, but a metropolitan area sort of generally refers to the area surrounding. Well, really, it's, as is there, it's a large-scale functional entity. It's a large-scale thing containing several urbanized areas that are integrated as an economic whole. So urbanized area could be sort of, if we're talking about scale here, we're talking about the central city being smaller, urbanized area, the greater regions urbanized surrounding that, and then the metropolitan area being many urbanized areas that are sort of integrated into one. I would argue for our purposes that you could consider the metropolitan area being the Baltimore-Washington area. So as it says in that purple one, extending all the way up into Baltimore, all the way down to Culpeper. We're talking the difference between those two regions. If you're looking at the Towson area down to Culpeper, that's a good 3-4 hour drive. So a large metropolitan area that's been sort of integrated as a whole. And the key there, it says integrated as an economic whole, meaning that the services and the industries and the businesses are fluid and they're certainly reliant upon one another. So when we talk about this urban geography and this development of cities, we're talking about what are the urban geographers looking at? They're looking at how the cities are physically arranged, what the cities look like, what the transportation and communication systems within the city are, and why people move from place to place within the actual city itself. The other thing I'm going to add to that is that in our context, we're also going to look at how the cities have actually emerged over time, which is what we'll talk about shortly. A couple other just general pieces of terminology that are helpful for this unit. The term hinterland refers to the surrounding service area of a city that includes smaller villages and hamlets. This is difficult to conceive of when you and I live in the city of DC, but the hinterland would be the area outside of the city. You and I live in a place where the area outside of the city is extraordinarily developed. But if we apply the hinterland to smaller areas, so for example, we had a much smaller city, the hinterland is going to be typically much more quickly becomes rural and less developed than it does here in the DC area. Centrality is the concept of the economic power or draw of a place compared to its competition. So we're also going to look at how cities have become dominant, what it is about a particular city that makes it central or dominant over others. So, okay, there's some of our basic vocab. Now let's jump into the historical development of cities. So historically, it's almost hard. You got to kind of take yourself back in time here and consider that we're going to a time period where the cities are not the norm. That most of human existence, human beings were hunter-gatherers and did not live in permanent, stable settlements. Historically, though, as cities developed, they had specialized functions. They were the political centers, they were social centers, they were economic centers. And what this has is I'm going to skip ahead one slide here, then I'll go back. Cities began to really form in what we call the formative period of urbanization, which is around 7,000 years ago. Now, where cities began are no different than your basic world history class, where you're talking about the river valley civilizations. We have the Maya, Aztec, and Inca, Olmecs, Toltecs, some of the early groups in Mesoamerica. Nile River Valley, the growth of early Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Sumerians, down to the Indus River Valley and the Huanghe River, which would be the early ancient China. Where cities actually began to develop in these regions because these areas had site advantages, so they had water, or they're, as I said, the advantageous sites. So in this instance, it's actually the fact that all of these civilizations had rivers with either predictable or simply beneficial flooding. And most importantly, the ones I bolded here is that they had agricultural surpluses and social stratification. Agricultural surpluses meaning they had enough food so everybody didn't have to farm. That's a key centerpiece of the development of any city, is that you have successful enough agricultural systems whereby other people can now engage in construction, can engage in education, art, so on and so forth. Also, these civilizations had social stratification, so they had some sort of ruling class or ruling elite that will then in turn become the leaders of that society. So in this way, we already see that from the formative period of urbanization, that these cities are starting to be designed around their function versus their physical area. So we kind of have to move away from the idea that even though you and I have defined boundaries of where DC is and where it isn't, we have to think of cities a little bit more as in the abstract, a little bit more of the ideas of this concept. This is an area, and in that area, certain things existed, which is exactly what began, or how cities emerged right from the get-go. What we have here too is that, as I said, then I just mentioned this. I'm being a little repetitive here. That cities had specialized functions. Then perhaps it was a religious city, a political center, an art center. And what this ultimately leads to is that cities have even more social stratification. You tend to have an urban elite, as you see in the top right corner, being the select part of society that's superior to other people. And those are the decision makers. Those are the ones that control the society. Ultimately, the needs of that urban elite lead to record writing and record keeping. And ultimately, those cities become the hub, the centerpiece of social organization, and really the glue that holds these cities together. These civilizations together. Some of the characteristics of those earliest cities, a lot of them are ruled by were theocratic theocracies, so a lot of them are ruled by religious figures. In more specifically, in case of Maya, Aztec, and Inca, we're looking at god kings who were are seen themselves as gods, or in the case over in ancient China, that they were selected by gods. So the city, a lot of power already being concentrated in that city. Some of the earliest then large-scale development of cities came along with was improved upon with ancient Greek civilization. So ancient Greece was highly urbanized. They had the Acropolis, which you see in the top, well, I guess top right here. Give me an arrow there, right there. Then we have the high city. The best structures were built at the highest point of this city, and then below that we have this agora, which is sort of the market space of the city. Which some of those architectural characteristics carried through to other cities, and particularly Western cities over time, that the best structures would be at the highest point in the city. Shortly thereafter, the Roman Empire is really the one that expanded this created what we would refer to as a massive urban system. So the ancient Greeks had these urban cities and these development of these cities, but it was the Romans who expanded the concept of a city beyond simply that of an individual place, and they did so with their fantastically successful transportation systems. So we have the Roman roads. You see there's also the Roman walls for protection. But the Roman roads ensured that the power, the structure, and the authority of the Roman Empire was felt all across throughout the entire civilization. They also adopted the grid pattern. You see that in the bottom right-hand corner, that the ancient Greeks, DC makes it a tough place to learn about this, because most cities are based upon grid systems, where you have first street, second street, third street, so on and so forth. In DC, we have that, but it's extremely complicated with the diagonal streets being state streets. Anyway, most cities are built upon the grid system. And the grid, just think of like your graph paper, where cities are all meeting at right angle, or streets are all meeting right angles. And that's something that the ancient Romans got from the Indus River Valley civilization, so that I showed you in the last map there. Romans were also creating public works systems. So we're talking about sewage, we're talking about bathrooms, bathing systems. That's an aqueduct down there to bring water to the cities. So we see cities starting to be organized and more functional, more livable. Now, that being said, they were also very disease-ridden, didn't have particularly good waste disposal and stuff. So let's not be fooled into thinking that these are clean and these are really organized places, or clean places, sanitary places. But they were, in fact, increasing in the amount of services offered to the people who lived there. Historically, cities were also walled. This is why it made it easy in ancient times to differentiate between what is a city and what is not a city. And they were walled because they were walled for protection. Now, that bottom picture, I want to be careful there. That's a theoretical picture of what Mesopotamia, some of the Mesopotamian civilizations may have looked like. You see that center walled city. You see the organized grid pattern. You see the farmland outside of the walls. That's just a theoretical. That's not actually a photograph. And the top right, though, you do see in Carcassonne, France, or Carcassonne, if we're going to get fancy. That's the you can see there the clear indication again of where the city begins and where it ends by the walls. And what that really kind of meant is that you had not only a physical barrier, but if you had the physical barrier separating the city from the outside, but it also became, as cities developed, particularly in Europe, you had this idea of the wealthy and the power sort of inside the city and the core of the city, and then the poor on the periphery. Now, that system still remains to this day, and particularly in Western Europe and really most of the rest of the world, that the wealthy live within the city, and the lower income people live outside of the city. In the U.S., we have a sort of an opposite pattern. Nowadays, though, bottom line here, when you don't have a wall like that to differentiate what's the city and what's not the city, defining what a quote-unquote city is no longer particularly easy. And I'm going to stick to the concept that we're going to use the accessibility, and the abundance of services in a given place to really help us understand what a city is and what it's not. Now, everything I just said, we of course are going to figure out why that's not actually true. Always the exception. Something to note, that the exceptions to the rules of what I just described, of sort of the central city, the walled city, there's a very different design in Muslim cities. The way Muslim cities were designed, that the landscape itself was really dominated by the mosque, and the centerpiece of the, if not the mosque, then the centerpiece of the city would be the bazaar, the market area. And that design still remains true. Another thing about Muslim cities is that the streets tend to be windy. In many of the Middle Eastern streets, in Middle Eastern cities, because that will maximize the amount of shade offered in those hot climates. And they're also the windows in a Muslim city. The buildings are not perfectly aligned, and that's to add increased privacy, particularly for women. So that way you can't stand in one building and look directly across into the other. So here we see the cultural imprint in the way and how the cultural beliefs are actually influencing the way the city itself is developing. Where cities develop also, of course, like anything else in our class, depends on site and situation factors. So we're talking about the physical equalities of a location. We got the development of Singapore. The island structure there really provided for some excellent development, confined development opportunities, and you can see the areas that were quickly urbanized. In the bottom left there, they've got Malaysia and then the entire Singapore island. They're just independent from that. Mexico City, this is an example where there's actually a problem associated with the site. Mexico City, which is the ancient capital of Tenochtitlan in the Aztec Empire, is flanked. Flanked means it's on both sides of, so it's flanked by mountains, and so the city itself is in a basin. And what that means is that the air pollution is completely trapped over the city. So that's a problem associated with the site of the original, but of where Mexico City is. It also means the city itself tends to be very noisy, very crowded, and there's a lot of slums there that are negatively impacted by the pollution and the crowded nature of the city. Situation factors also determine where cities develop. So situation being where something is in relation to something else. So transportation routes, access to farmland, access to other manufacturing towns, or just towns on the whole. All of these are going to influence whether or not a city, or how a city develops over time. You can see in the top right there with the picture of Paris. You can see the site of Paris. They're right along the Seine River. And you can see the situation of Paris is well situated for transportation networks all across Western Europe. So both site and situation influencing the development there. You do not need to copy this down. I just want to show you some other ones of site and situation, how they influence where something develops. Chicago had the situational advantage of the Great Lakes and the Mississippi water. It was a real junction, meaning a point of contact, an intersection between the industrial core area. So you got the what we now think of the Rust Belt, but the traditional manufacturing region of the United States, right next to all this farmland. So Chicago really functions situationally. It got to develop as a result of its access to both the agricultural resources and the industrial resources. It's also, to this day, a major air route junction, kind of being not just midway, but relatively, I guess conceivably, we say in the middle of the United States, that serves as a transportation hub. And there's a lot of, there's that word hinterland, major natural resources in the hinterland region. So the development of Chicago very much advantageous because of its situational factors. Another example there in the Guangdong, I'm sure I just mutilated that pronunciation, province in southern China, that its urban proximity, you can see the access to Hong Kong, the special economic zone. This is also ensuring that, actually I'm going to use the arrows here. So you can see here down in Hong Kong, then you get the access to the surrounding regions. This region is going to develop as a result of its prime access to Hong Kong. Hong Kong, again, was once a British colony and had tremendous economic, it was a stronghold in China now, even to this day. And the surrounding hinterland is allowed them to benefit, as it says here, from the commerce and the trade that's coming into Hong Kong. One of the things to keep in mind, though, is that situational characteristics can change. The area surrounding a city can be both an advantage and a disadvantage because it can change over time. Some examples of that: areas that were once benefiting from their situational advantages being close to the manufacturing belt. Well, we all know now that that's the Rust Belt. So that's being what was once an advantage is now really a challenge, that there's no longer going to be economic opportunity rooted in that region. In Berlin, in Germany, that city itself was destroyed during World War I. World War I and was after World War II was divided during the Cold War, and I should say World War II, destroyed during World War II, and divided in the Cold War. And what this is ultimately demonstrating again is that what can at one time be an advantage is sometimes can then in turn be a disadvantage over time. Similarly, if you have a rural town and you're building transportation systems, if the town itself is bypassed in the construction of that highway, then that can almost doom a town to no longer be connected to highways. There's a great example of that in St. Louis, the East St. Louis versus West St. Louis, and the fact that many of the African American towns were bypassed by the highway system, or the highway system cut into the town itself. So now all of a sudden, your situation has changed. You're no longer relatively close to something else, and that can negatively impact the development. There is another author here. I'm going to pause for 1 second to explain the stages of urban development and how he defined different stages of the urban development of this society. Okay, we're back. So here, this is a Swedish geographer whose name I am just going to destroy. It's something on the order of Sjöbergi, something along those lines. I apologize in advance if you know how to say that. Please come teach me. But this man, Gideon S., we'll call him, he had a different way of describing how a city develops over time and how it emerges and grows in these conditions. And he said that all cities were a product of their societies and went through stages. We had the folk, or kind of pre-literate society. Then you'll have a feudal society where you've got an urban or ruling elite class. And then you'll have a pre-industrial society. And then as the city itself begins to industrialize, you have the urban industrial society. And he was also the first person to identify something I'm going to define now but return to much later, which is called primate cities. So primate city is a city that's a nation's leading city in size, and it's really above anything else. It's an expression of their national culture. So that city sort of symbolizes and embodies what it means to be a citizen of blank, usually a cultural hub. And he was one who first identified that trend over time. Last thing we're going to talk about is the evolution specifically of Western cities. So we kind of touched on that already when we talked about ancient Greece and ancient Rome. We're going to see how Western cities emerged over time. So Western cities, again, referring to Western European cities, and then the diffusion of those types of cities ultimately over to the United States. First, we have what's called medieval cities, and these medieval cities were just like you learn about World History 1 in medieval times, in the medieval age, I should say. Medieval times is that restaurant. Medieval cities were dirty. They had very narrow streets. They had very poor sanitation, hence why we had the bubonic plague. They were dangerous, and the landscape itself, one of its key features, was dominated by the church. So you'd see the church would be sort of the central figure in the city landscape. Things began to change in the 16th and 17th century when cities went not from just being residential centers, but rather being regions or nodes of regional and national and international trade. So these mercantile or mercantile, depending on how you pronounce it, but mercantile cities are going to be the cities that are now in the 16th and 17th century largely as a product of colonization. So some of these Western European countries are now going out and colonizing, and that wealth is ultimately brought back to the mother country or the metropole. And consequently, we have cities like Lisbon in Portugal, we've got Amsterdam in the Netherlands. These cities are now becoming massive regional and international trading centers. And you can see that a lot of that wealth that they were gaining from the colonial trade was actually pumped into the physical landscape itself. So this is the time period where you see churches like the one I have here being built as a product or as a sign of that emerging wealth. What changed, just like we talked about population changes with the Industrial Revolution, industrial changes with the Industrial Revolution, economic development changes, we also see changes in cities as a result of the Industrial Revolution. So we go from medieval cities to mercantile cities to manufacturing cities. So after the Second Agricultural Revolution, people began to have a lot more food, and they began to they began to have more food, population booms, and we also then have the ability to feed more people. In turn, people began moving to the cities where they could be fed, sort of a chicken and the eggs argument here, that the Industrial Revolution helped the Second Agricultural Revolution. The Second Agricultural Revolution helped fuel the Industrial Revolution in the terms of feeding population. So bottom line here, we have people migrating from rural areas to cities, and I don't know why it says two cities twice. Sorry about that. When they're migrating from these rural areas to cities, then we have now the ability to actually feed people. And we've got manufacturing plants that were largely concentrated within the cities themselves. This first happened in England, and then there's obviously the origin of the Industrial Revolution spreading to North America and Western Europe. And lastly, I should say number 4, I made 2 typos on one slide. Lastly, what we start to see is over time, particularly after World War II in the United States, we see the emergence of what was called the modern city. And what we have here is that the growth of the widespread purchase of automobiles is going to allow for enormous growth, physical growth of the city, and the opportunity for the people to live farther away from the city. So we've got transportation systems, we now have road systems, and this is really going to lead to the growth of what we now know as the suburbs. People can't live in the suburbs if you don't have a car. You and I live in a place where you can just get on the metro, get on the bus, and go wherever you need to go, or grab a cab. But if you're in the suburbs, that just doesn't exist. It's either your feet or a car, and occasionally bus systems, but particularly not in the exurbs, and really in the suburbs sometimes. But bottom line here is the modern city is defined by the automobile, and the automobile is allowing people to live farther, to basically live an entire life outside of the city itself. Our modern Western city, so the city that in the modern day, what we think of as being the city, sorry about that, is the fact that cities are just transformed and defined by transportation, like I just said. We got the massive growth of the suburbs. That's called suburbanization. Use TION as a process, so the process of growing suburbs. This began, like I just mentioned, in the 1920s with the creation of the automobile, and really blew up after World War II when the soldiers came home after the Great Depression. People were able to buy cars in the 1950s on much larger scales. We had the growth of modern America, sprawling suburbs. We've got shopping malls are now going to grow. Hotelling's theory and agglomeration tell us that we're going to go where the market is. We see the emergence of office parks, and really ultimately the growth of the hinterland, which is the area outside of the suburbs. Okay, one of the last defining characteristics of modern day cities. We've firmly established at this point that a city is not a clearly identifiable or defined characteristic, or a set of characteristics. One way that one definition that we will use is called a metropolitan statistical area. And this would be an area, this is used by the U.S. Census, or measured by the U.S. Census. And what it means is in the U.S., this is defined as a central city of at least 50,000 people in a county in which the city is located in the adjacent counties with economic ties throughout the area. Whoa. Okay. Bottom line, an MSA is going to be an area of at least 50,000 people who are all economically tied to one another based around one general city. So this is further making it hazy to understand what is a city versus what is an urbanized area versus what is a rural area or a suburban area. Metropolitan statistical area makes it easy. You and I can think of this as like the DMV, the District, Maryland, Virginia, and the surrounding area. These are the surrounding suburbs there. That these are the areas that are all the people that are economically linked by DC or sometimes Baltimore, and those areas are all. And you have at least 50,000 people, so you got that connection with the number of people, the population in the area. You can see here's the DC Metropolitan Statistical Area. You can see the core region. That concept of core and periphery just never goes away. So you get the core region sort of right in DC. And you can this is actually kind of interesting because you can see the development of an edge city here, which we'll come back to, out in Fairfax County in the Falls Church region. But anyway, you can see our central region, then we've got the suburban region, and then ultimately the exurban region, the ex-urban region, where those bedroom communities far away with much longer commutes into the general city. So that would be the Metropolitan Statistical Area for DC. You can see here's one in St. Louis. This helps us a little bit more. You can see the city of St. Louis, the urbanized area, and then the MSA, including the broader suburbs and exurbs thereafter. So you can see the general scope of the city's influence. There's also something called a consolidated metropolitan statistical area, which is when multiple MSAs overlap. This is the world that you and I live in. Just can't get away from that term. The Boswash Corridor region, where one MSA kind of bleeds into the next, which you can see actually right here if you look at DC. I mean, Frederick, you're getting pretty close to Baltimore's influence. There's people live in the upper areas of Montgomery County that live in Baltimore. Heck, a lot of people live in D.C., that work in D.C., live in the Baltimore region. So our MSA is defined, but it's really more like we're a component of a consolidated MSA when there's lots of different MSAs that are bleeding together into one. I like this map here. You can see this is the MSA, U.S. Metropolitan Statistical, or Metropolitan areas. These are not MSAs, but sort of general metropolitan regions with the transportation system that links them. And oh my goodness, a pause for a third time, but here are your analysis questions coming, and I'm going to fix that last one right there, so give me 1 second. Okay, there we go. So there are your analysis questions, and I will see you in class.